The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. Martin Kowalski held it in his weathered hands, the paper trembling slightly, not from age, but from the anger he was trying to contain. Beside him, Elena read over his shoulder, her jaw tightening as she reached the bottom of the page. They had 30 days to bring their property into compliance or face legal action and liens that would force the sale of their home. 30 days to tear out Elena's vegetable garden because it violated the landscaping covenant. 30 days to repaint their house a pre-approved color because the cream they'd chosen was 2 shades off the acceptable palette. 30 days to remove the wooden bench Martin had built for their porch because it wasn't made from HOA-approved materials. It was the 14th letter in 18 months, and it would be the last one they'd ever read. Martin and Elena had lived in the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision for 23 years. They'd bought the house when Martin retired from the post office, thinking the planned community would be a peaceful place to spend their later years. For the first decade, it had been. They'd known their neighbors, kept their modest home neat and welcoming, and lived quietly. But Meadowbrook had changed. Property values had climbed. Young families with money had moved in, bringing with them an obsession with perfection and property values. The HOA board had turned over completely, replaced by people who saw the neighborhood as an investment portfolio rather than a community. The harassment had started small. A notice about their mailbox needing fresh paint. A warning that their grass was a quarter-inch too long. Elena had laughed it off at first, thinking it was just bureaucratic nonsense. But the notices kept coming, each one more petty than the last. The garden that Elena had tended for 2 decades, that produced tomatoes and peppers and beans that she shared with neighbors, was suddenly a violation because vegetables weren't on the approved plant list. The bench Martin had built from reclaimed oak, sanded smooth and finished with care, was unauthorized outdoor furniture. The wind chimes that had hung from their porch for 15 years were now classified as noise pollution. They'd tried to comply at first. Martin had repainted the mailbox. They'd mowed more frequently, even though Martin's knees ached after pushing the mower. But every time they fixed one violation, 2 more appeared. The HOA president, Karen Whitmore, had made it her personal mission to bring their property into what she called community standards. She'd stand in their driveway with her clipboard, photographing every perceived infraction, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. She'd told them once, in a voice dripping with false concern, that perhaps they should consider moving somewhere more manageable for people their age, somewhere they wouldn't have to worry about keeping up with neighborhood standards. Elena had wanted to fight. She'd talked about lawyers, about showing up at HOA meetings, about organizing other neighbors who were also being harassed. But Martin was tired. At 81, he didn't have the energy for legal battles that could drag on for years. They didn't have the money for lawyers who charged hundreds of dollars an hour. And more than that, he was tired of living in a place where every small joy, Elena's garden, his handmade bench, the wind chimes that reminded them of their honeymoon in Maine, was treated as a crime. That night, after Elena had gone to bed, Martin sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in front of him. He was thinking about his grandfather, Stanislaw, who had come to America from Poland in 1923. Stanislaw had lived his first 40 years in a stone cottage in the Tatra Mountains, where he'd raised sheep and grew potatoes and lived by the rhythms of the seasons. He'd told young Martin stories about that life, stories about heating the cottage with a wood stove, about fetching water from a mountain spring, about the silence of winter snow and the abundance of summer gardens. Stanislaw had adapted to American life, had worked in factories, and raised his family in a small house with electricity and indoor plumbing. But he'd always said the mountains were where he'd been happiest, where life had been simple and real. Martin had loved those stories as a boy. Stanislaw had taught him things: how to build a fire that would burn all night, how to preserve food for winter, how to read weather in the sky and find water underground. Skills that had seemed like quaint history lessons, relics of a world that no longer existed. But sitting in his HOA-approved kitchen, holding a letter threatening to take his home, Martin wondered if that world was really gone, or if it was just waiting up in the mountains somewhere for people who were brave enough or desperate enough to find it. He pulled out his laptop, a gift from his daughter that he'd learned to use with patient determination, and started searching. Remote properties in Appalachia, off-grid cabins, mountain land. He wasn't sure what he was looking for until he found it. A small stone cottage in the mountains of West Virginia, built in the 1880s by settlers who'd come from the old country. It had been abandoned for decades, sitting on 40 acres of forest that a distant cousin of the original owners wanted to sell for almost nothing. No electricity, no plumbing, no road access beyond an old logging trail. The photos showed a structure that was still standing, stone walls thick and solid, though the roof would need work. It was 3 hours from any real town, surrounded by national forest on 3 sides. It was exactly what Stanislaw had described, and it was exactly what Martin hadn't realized he'd been looking for his entire life. When he showed Elena the listing the next morning, she was quiet for a long time. She studied the photos, read the description twice, and then looked at her husband with eyes that held both fear and something else, something that looked like hope. They talked for hours that day, about whether they were crazy to even consider this, about whether they could survive without modern conveniences, about what their children would say, about whether at their age they had the strength for such a radical change. But they kept coming back to the same question. What was the alternative? Stay here and spend their remaining years fighting petty bureaucrats over the color of their paint and the height of their grass? Watch Elena's garden be torn out and replaced with HOA-approved shrubs? Spend their savings on legal fees and fines? Live in constant stress, constantly monitored, constantly found wanting? Or take a chance? Go to the mountains, live simply, the way their grandparents had lived. Own their last years instead of having them owned by others. Elena made the decision. She was the one who called the number on the listing. She was the one who negotiated the price down even further, explaining to the seller that they were an elderly couple looking for a place to live out their days in peace. She was the one who arranged for a friend with a truck to drive them up to see the property before they committed. And she was the one who, standing in front of that old stone cottage with its missing roof boards and overgrown clearing, said the words that changed everything. "We can make this work." They had 3 weeks before the HOA's deadline. They spent it preparing. Martin sold his car. They wouldn't need it where they were going. Elena sold most of their furniture, keeping only what they could transport and what would be useful in a home without electricity. They bought tools, axes, saws, hammers, nails. They bought supplies, dried beans, rice, flour, salt, sugar, seeds for planting. They bought warm clothes, sturdy boots, wool blankets. They bought books about traditional skills, food preservation, natural medicine, wild edibles, shelter building. Their daughter Sarah came by during the second week. She'd heard about the HOA troubles and wanted to help them fight. When they told her their plan, she thought they were joking. Then she thought they were having some kind of crisis. She'd tried everything: reason, emotion, fear. She'd talked about their health, about what would happen if they got sick, about how isolated they'd be, about how hard physical labor would be at their age. She'd begged them to move in with her instead, to let her help them find a reasonable apartment, to not throw their lives away on some fantasy. Martin had listened patiently. Then he'd taken his daughter's hand and said something he'd never quite articulated before. "Sarah, we've lived the modern way for 81 years. We've had electricity and cars and all the conveniences, and you know what? We're tired. We're tired of bills and regulations and people telling us how to live." Your great-grandfather Stanislaw lived to 94 in a stone cottage in the mountains. He was happy, he was healthy, he was free. Maybe that's not throwing our lives away. Maybe that's finally living them the way we were meant to. Sarah had left in tears. She'd called them foolish and stubborn. She'd said she couldn't support this decision. But 3 days before they left, she'd come back with her car full of supplies, a good cast-iron pot, wool socks, a medical kit, jars for canning. She'd hugged them both, crying, and made them promise to get word to her somehow, to let her know they were all right. They'd promised. They'd meant it. But they also knew that where they were going, promises about staying in touch might be hard to keep. On the last day, they didn't tell anyone they were leaving. They simply loaded their things into the truck their friend had agreed to drive, locked the door of the house they'd lived in for 23 years, and left the keys on the kitchen counter. Let the HOA figure it out. Let Karen Whitmore stand in the driveway with her clipboard and photograph an empty house. They were done. The drive took 6 hours, the last 2 on increasingly rough roads. The logging trail to the property was barely passable, and they had to stop twice to clear fallen branches. When they finally reached the cottage, it was late afternoon, and the spring sun was filtering through the bare trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. Martin and Elena stood side by side, looking at what would be their home, and felt something they hadn't felt in years. Possibility. The cottage was small, 1 room, maybe 15 feet by 20 feet, with stone walls 3 feet thick and a partial roof that let in patches of sky. There was a stone fireplace on one wall, its chimney still intact. The floor was dirt, packed hard by a century of feet. There were no windows, just openings in the stone that had once held wooden shutters. But the walls were solid. The foundation was sound, and it was theirs, completely and utterly theirs, with no HOA to tell them what they could do with it. They spent the first week just making it livable. Martin and Elena worked from dawn until dusk, their bodies aching in ways they hadn't felt in years, but their minds clearer than they'd been in decades. They patched the roof with boards and tar paper they'd brought, creating a waterproof shelter. They hung a heavy canvas over the doorway until Martin could build a proper door. They cleared the fireplace of debris and tested it, watching with satisfaction as smoke drew up the chimney. They swept the floor and laid down boards in one corner to create a sleeping area, piling it with the blankets and sleeping bags they'd brought. Water was their first priority. There was a spring about 100 yards from the cottage, just where the old property map had indicated. The water ran clear and cold, bubbling up from between rocks and forming a small pool before trickling down the mountainside. Elena tested it with the kit Sarah had given them, and it was clean. They established a routine. Every morning, Martin would make 2 trips to the spring with their water containers, bringing back enough for drinking, cooking, and washing. It was hard work, but it was work with a purpose he could see and feel. Food was next. They'd brought supplies, but they needed to think long-term. Elena had brought seeds, tomatoes, beans, squash, potatoes, herbs. She found a sunny spot near the cottage where the soil looked promising and began preparing a garden. The ground was hard after the winter, and turning it with a spade made her shoulders burn. But she'd grown up on a farm, and her hands remembered the work even if her body protested. Martin built a simple fence from fallen branches to keep deer out, weaving the wood together in a pattern his grandfather had shown him 70 years ago. They cooked over the fireplace, learning again how to manage heat without knobs to turn. Elena made soup in the cast-iron pot Sarah had given them, letting it simmer for hours over the coals. They baked bread on a flat stone Martin had positioned in the fireplace, the way Stanislaw had described. The first loaf was burned on the bottom and raw in the middle, and they'd laughed until they cried. The second was better. By the end of the first month, Elena could judge the heat by holding her hand over the coals and could produce bread that was golden and perfect. The nights were the hardest adjustment. Without electricity, darkness came completely. They'd brought oil lamps and candles, and the fireplace provided light, but there were hours of blackness that neither of them had experienced since childhood. At first, it felt oppressive, but gradually they began to appreciate it. They went to bed when darkness fell and woke with the dawn. Their sleep was deeper than it had been in years, and the stars, they'd forgotten how many stars there were when no light pollution washed them out. They would sit outside on clear nights, wrapped in blankets, watching the sky and feeling very small and very much a part of something larger than themselves. Spring turned to summer. Elena's garden flourished in the mountain soil. The tomatoes grew heavy on their vines. The beans climbed the poles Martin had set for them. The potatoes multiplied underground. She learned which wild plants were edible: dandelion greens, wild onions, blackberries that grew in thick patches at the edge of the clearing. Martin learned to fish in the stream that ran through the lower part of their property, using techniques his grandfather had taught him. They ate fresh food every day, food they'd grown or caught themselves, and it tasted better than anything they'd bought in a grocery store. They worked constantly, but it was work that made sense. Gathering firewood for the winter, preserving food, drying beans, canning tomatoes, smoking fish. Making improvements to the cottage. Martin built a proper door, hung shutters on the window openings, constructed a covered porch where they could sit in the rain. Elena made curtains from fabric she'd brought, sewed by hand in the evenings by lamplight. They built an outhouse at a respectful distance from the cottage, and while it wasn't comfortable, it was functional. Their bodies changed. The soft middle-aged spread they'd both carried melted away. Martin's arms grew corded with muscle from chopping wood and carrying water. Elena's hands developed calluses from garden work, and her legs grew strong from walking the mountain paths. They moved more slowly than young people would have, and they had to rest more often, but they were capable, more capable than they'd felt in decades. They had visitors occasionally, a hiker who'd wandered off the trail and was surprised to find someone living in the old cottage, a hunter who stopped to ask permission to cross their land and stayed for coffee, made in a pot over the fire. A forest ranger who checked on them once, concerned about the elderly couple he'd heard were living without modern amenities, but left satisfied that they knew what they were doing and wanted to be left alone. The ranger had asked if they needed anything, if they wanted help getting connected to services. Martin had thanked him and said no. They had everything they needed right here. The ranger had looked around at the simple cottage, the garden, the woodpile, and the smoke rising from the chimney, and he'd nodded slowly. "Looks like you do," he'd said. "Looks like you really do." Summer faded into fall, and the mountains transformed into gold and red. Martin and Elena worked harder than ever, preparing for winter. They'd been told by the old-timers in the nearest town, a 3-hour walk away, that mountain winters were serious business. They cut and stacked wood until they had a pile that Martin estimated would last 4 months. They harvested the last of the garden and preserved everything they could. They chinked gaps in the stone walls with mud and moss. They hung heavy blankets inside to create a smaller, more heat-efficient living space within the cottage. When the first snow came in November, they were ready. The cottage stayed warm with the fire burning, though they had to tend it constantly. They melted snow for water when the spring became difficult to reach. They ate the food they'd preserved and rationed their supplies carefully. The days were short, and they spent long evenings by the fire, talking or reading by lamplight or simply sitting in comfortable silence. It was during those winter months that Martin realized something profound. He wasn't afraid anymore. For years, decades maybe, he'd carried a low-grade anxiety about everything: bills, health, regulations, disappointing people, getting older, becoming a burden. But here, in this stone cottage in the mountains, living the way his grandfather had lived, he felt none of that. There were real challenges: keeping warm, staying fed, maintaining the shelter. But they were challenges he could meet with his own hands and his own mind. There was no bureaucrat to please, no form to fill out, no arbitrary rule to follow. Just the simple, direct relationship between effort and result. Elena felt it too. She'd spent most of her life trying to be what others expected: a good daughter, a good wife, a good neighbor, a good member of the community. She'd spent energy she didn't have maintaining appearances and following rules that made no sense. Here, the only expectations were the ones nature imposed. Stay warm, stay fed, stay safe. And those expectations felt honest, fair, achievable. They made it through the winter. When spring came again and the snow melted and the forest came back to life, they planted an even bigger garden. They'd learned from the first year. They knew which crops did well in the mountain soil and which didn't. They knew how much wood they needed and how to pace themselves through the seasons. They were no longer novices playing at mountain life. They were mountain people. Their daughter Sarah visited once in the summer of their second year. She'd hiked in with a backpack full of supplies they didn't need, worried about what she'd find. Instead, she found her parents younger somehow, despite being 2 years older. They were lean and weathered, their skin tanned from outdoor work, their movements purposeful and strong. They showed her around with pride: the expanded garden, the improved cottage, the smokehouse Martin had built, the root cellar they dug into the hillside. Sarah had stayed for 3 days, sleeping on the floor by the fire, eating food from the garden, washing in cold water from the spring. On the last evening, sitting outside the cottage, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, she'd said something that made both her parents cry. "I was wrong. I thought you were running away, but you weren't. You were running towards something, and you found it." They lived simply, Martin and Elena Kowalski. They woke with the sun and slept with the dark. They grew food and preserved it. They gathered wood and kept the fire burning. They fixed what broke and made do with what they had. They bathed in the stream in summer and in a basin by the fire in winter. They wore the same clothes until they wore out, then patched them until they couldn't be patched anymore. They owned almost nothing and wanted for almost nothing. They were 83 and 81 now, 2 years into their mountain life, and they were happy. Not the fleeting happiness of entertainment or distraction, but the deep, bone-level contentment that comes from living in alignment with your values and your capabilities. They'd chosen this life when most people their age were choosing assisted living facilities. They'd walked away from everything modern society said they needed and discovered they needed very little. Sometimes, usually in the evenings, they would talk about the old life, about the HOA and Karen Whitmore, and the certified letters and the stress. It felt like something that had happened to different people in a different lifetime. They wondered sometimes what had happened to the house, whether the HOA had seized it for unpaid fines, whether someone else lived there now, following all the rules, keeping their grass at the approved height. They didn't miss it. Not the house, not the neighborhood, not any of it. What they had instead was this: a stone cottage with smoke rising from its chimney, a garden that fed them, a spring that gave them water, a forest that provided wood and shelter and wild food. Each other, after 59 years of marriage, still partners in the truest sense. And freedom, the real freedom that comes not from having endless choices, but from choosing deliberately and living with the consequences of that choice. They'd been forced out at 81, harassed and regulated until they had no choice but to leave. The HOA had thought they were driving out a problem, getting rid of people who didn't fit the community standards. They'd thought they were winning, but Martin and Elena Kowalski, living in their stone cottage in the mountains, cooking over an open fire, drinking water from a spring, growing food in the soil, and sleeping under more stars than most people see in a lifetime. They knew different. They knew who had really won. They'd vanished into the mountains and found something most people spend their whole lives searching for: a life that was entirely, authentically, uncompromisingly their own. The old ways weren't gone. They were just waiting, up in the mountains, for people brave enough to claim them. and Martin and Elena had claimed them. At 81 and 79, when the world said they should be settling into decline, they'd instead stepped into the fullest, freest, most genuine years of their lives. They had no regrets, none at all.